You're listening to Grind Less, Flow More. It is February 2011, and the big idea suddenly hits you. You're out of hustle culture and on a sabbatical. Alex, take us there.
So, this is an evening at a cafe in Cambridge, England called Clowns of Cambridge. And I was at Microsoft Research Cambridge spending 3 months doing the research that eventually becomes a book called The Distraction Addiction. And, you know, I had been living in Silicon Valley for the previous 10 years or so, sort of working as a technology forecaster and consultant. And as is often the case with this sort of work that is fascinating but high pressure, had found myself sort of reaching a point where I was perpetually like half a project out of sync and always trying to spend spend more time at the office, sort of try and do more. And eventually I burned out on this and left that job. Fortunately got the opportunity to go to Microsoft and sort of start up something new. And one evening I was there and was reading a book by John Kay called Obliquity, which is about how big challenges often are ones that you can't approach directly, but rather you have to approach obliquely because they're super complex. They've got a lot of moving parts. And so going straight at them paradoxically is often not the most effective way to solve them. And it made me think, I was at this point reading an awful lot. I was getting enormous amounts of stuff done. I was writing. I was having really interesting conversations. But I realized I didn't have that kind of sense of perpetual kind of time poverty and stress that was part of that, was just part of life in Silicon Valley. And it made me think, maybe our assumptions about or pressure and long hours as either the cost of doing business or of just necessities that we have to endure in order to do work that we're really passionate about to achieve great things in this world. Maybe those ideas are backwards. Maybe in order to do really great work, we have to find ways of sort of building more of what I had discovered on this sabbatical, right? Sort of time going out on long walks, taking weekends and going traveling, doing interesting things that didn't directly feed into my work, but certainly stimulated my creativity. This was an idea that, there are some kinds of ideas that you have that kind of stick in your mind and won't go away. And even though I wrote this other book first, this was one of those ideas that just kept coming back. And eventually I started looking at the lives, biographies of scientists or statesmen or inventors, and realized that when you looked carefully at their daily schedules, you saw this kind of pattern that was similar to what I had found when I was on sabbatical. And that one of the keys to understanding what made them great, what allowed them to accomplish what they had, was that they all discovered this common pattern of sort of layering periods of work and rest, of taking leisure really seriously, finding time for it, and doing so in ways that allowed them to be more creative, to be more innovative, but also to have longer, more sustainable careers and more fulfilled lives. And so once I began to see this as a pattern across all kinds of lives, and also discovered that there was some interesting science that helped at least peel back some of our, sort of open up a little bit of the black box of what made this interesting or why this worked, I realized this was a story that I had to tell. But it really goes back to that evening at Clowns of Cambridge.
That's incredible. And reading the book, you mentioned a lot of, especially you skewed towards writers and scientists, and those are people that need to be really focused. And you mentioned like anyone who's anyone, right? Why don't you talk about maybe pick out a couple of those that could be relevant for the entrepreneur who does some deep work, but they're also working on hiring, raising money, strategy, sales, and some creativity. But
Mhm.
let's start with like the uber creative, and we'll kind of slide into how that can work into the workflow of the busy entrepreneur.
Sure. So, you know, actually, one example that jumps to mind is Dwight Eisenhower during World War II. Right, he was Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. He was tasked with with the project of assembling an army that would invade Europe and defeat Hitler and win the war. Now, this was an enterprise that his boss George Marshall thought required a huge amount of innovative thinking as well as managerial capacity and sort of logistical and political acumen. But fundamentally what he needed was someone who could envision all kinds of different possibilities and think creatively about this problem. Now, Eisenhower, it turns out, when he was sort of doing this work, he was spending like long days planning this out, but he had um, kind of an escape hatch for himself. He had a little he his chief of staff rented a little cottage out in the country called Telegraph Cottage, where nobody knew where it was, nobody else was allowed to go there, and every chance he got, Ike and a couple of his aides would go down there, play golf, do target practice. He'd read Zane Grey novels and so on, and talked about and his staff talked about this as being absolutely essential for for restoring his energy, lifting his spirits, and making it possible for him to do this immensely complicated thing that ultimately helped win the war. And I think that this is so even for people who at a daily basis can't necessarily work rest into their daily schedules. If you've got a job that's very reactive, you're spending a lot of time with people, you're in a lot of meetings. It is as was the case for Eisenhower, having these clear boundaries, both physical and mental, where you can get away and put all of that behind you is really essential for sort of success the rest of the week. um, an example of someone who manages to work this into their daily schedules, my favorite is, someone like Charles Darwin, who, in contrast to Eisenhower, spent, 20 years working on his book about the theory of evolution. But his daily schedule was one where he got up super early, would go for a walk, and then spend about, let's say, like 3 hours in his study, working really hard, take a break after about 90 minutes, but then go back in. And then by noon, he was pretty much, or if he would sort of stop, have lunch, and then he would go for a long walk on a path at the edge of his property. He called it his thinking path. And he would spend a couple hours out there turning over ideas that he'd been working on or that morning, but which he hadn't solved. And then he'd come out and then spend maybe another hour or so sort of working, kind of set up stuff for the next, write down those ideas, set stuff up for the next day, and then he was done. So if you add up the number of hours Darwin did what we would regard as like work, he was only working like 4 or 5 hours a day. And yet, doing this consistently, making it really deep work, he was able to sort of work out a set of ideas about the evolution of species that changed the course of intellectual and human history. And so I think he's a brilliant example of how when you have time over your schedule, layering these periods of really deep focused work with periods of deliberate rest give you an opportunity both to kind of recharge the mental and physical batteries that you spend working, but also give your kind of creative subconscious a chance to continue working on ideas that or outstanding questions that you haven't been able to answer just by, or of attacking them straight on. And and that in turn makes it more likely that your subconscious will be able to come up with a new approach to a problem or sort of an angle that you hadn't seen previously. You know, generate those sorts of aha moments that can really lead to breakthroughs or novel solutions. And by doing this every day in a systematic way, allow you to make more progress than you would working far, far longer hours. So, um, Darwin is an especially good example of a model that we see repeated in tons of Nobel laureates and mathematicians and writers and other folks. But he offers a particular clarity in how this model works, why it works, and what we get from it.
Yeah, that's great. And I want to dive more into the creative subconscious because, some things that came up for me, as you mentioned, a lot of that was, well, number one, Eisenhower did something that I think Bill Gates does very often once a year. He calls it his reading week. And then there's
Right.
the walking part of it, right? That's like the famous Steve Jobs walk with someone and ideas come, whether it's synchronous or he's by himself. And then you got the proverbial shower aha moment. Now,
Hmm.
all those things there seem like what you've mentioned, where the creative subconscious has ideas bubble up. Now, I think the objection to why a busy entrepreneur will not do that is because it doesn't seem structured enough. And I
Hmm.
like the fact that you kind of leaned more into some structure where, well, I mean, there's two approaches. One is unstructured walking. You don't think of anything, it comes to you, and that's a certain kind of eureka of getting a certain way of getting eureka moments. The other one that you talked about was more deliberate. You work on a problem. You even write it down on a piece of paper, and they say that if you write down half the problem with even a word that's not quite written out, there's this incompletion loop that your body's like trying to desperately to solve, and
Hmm.
and then you go on your walk, or some people do it before they go to bed, and then the
Right.
subconscious is stimulated. So talk about the creative subconscious in terms of like what's the science to get the eureka moment, whether it's not setting an intentional problem to work on and or just flowing for 1 or 2 hours, and then I guess the idea that's most pertinent will come up. Let's dive more into that because that's something that I haven't seen something super tangible on, and, you're the scientist here, so I'd love to hear.
Sure. So, there's been okay. So, our understanding of the creative subconscious and how it works kind of flows from two bodies of research. There's neuroscience that has been exploring the operation of what they call the default mode network, which is sort of a set of connections in the brain that light up whenever we kind of relax our attention and kind of think about nothing at all. It often feels like our brains shut down in those moments, but in fact what's going on is that our brains are just as busy. They look just as busy in an fMRI machine. It's just that different parts of the brain are sort of linking together. And they're parts that are associated with sort of creative thinking, with visualization, often with thinking about either the past or the future. And our brains love to activate the default mode network. Literally, in the time it takes you to blink, the default mode network will start to switch on. Now, there's a second body of research on mind wandering, which is not putting people in fMRI machines, but is kind of observing them out in the world. And what researchers have found is that when we let our minds wander, they tend to go to either thinking about the past, sort of planning for the future, or thinking about problems that we haven't solved yet. And so the pattern that we see, that kind of daily pattern of layering periods of sort of deep work and deliberate rest, is one that sort of creates a kind of structure around mind wandering so that you are in a sense loading your mind up, loading up your brain with or problems that with unsolved problems, and kind of tempting the default mode of to take them on while you are out on the walk or on the treadmill or doing something that is that is maybe physically engaging but cognitively fairly low intensity. And doing the so one piece of structure around this has to do with the timing, right? The deep work first, and then the mind wandering. The other part of it, the other piece of structure is doing this on a regular basis. So, the people, you hear the great stories of aha moments or sudden, or of sudden bolts of inspiration do not come from people who, you know, who are it doesn't just happen at random, right? The people like the great mathematician Henri Poincaré, who identified several of these in his life, he was someone who practiced this kind of schedule on a regular basis. And dive into his biography, there are lots of little moments where he's got these, sort of new ways of approaching a problem. But for him, there were three. This pattern paid off in three really big sets of insights that like advance the fields of pure mathematics. And so doing this on a regular basis, doing it as part of a regular daily routine doesn't guarantee exactly that the subconscious is going to or take on these problems on your behalf. The subconscious, being the subconscious, is going to kind of do what it wants, but you can at least tilt the field in favor of these problems that you've been working on by constructing that kind of daily framework, that kind of layering of periods of deep work and deliberate rest, to raise the odds that you'll get those aha moments sort of will occur for you.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thanks for clarifying that. So, like, yeah, I'm sold. That's the way it's got to happen. And, and there's a lot of literature around how the default mode network, I guess, is activated when people try microdosing, psychedelics, and or meditation. There's so many different modalities, and we'll get to the modalities and the tactics. And I guess we're actually leading into that right now. So let's put this into like the use case of a founder. Okay.
Right.
Alex, I'm going to start to do this. I'm going to like prime a problem, either write it down, have it in my head. It'll be after I maybe worked on the problem or something related. So have a deep work session. So my mind is kind of warmed up and thinking about it. I'm just going to disconnect. And now I'm going to go on a 20-minute walk, or I'm going to have
Right.
a 21-minute nap. What is the modality to really kind of let that simmer? If Is there differences between walk, rest, deep play? There's different modalities you talk about in the book. Does
Mhm.
it matter? And yeah, what is and how long should someone make this a habit for until it's something that perhaps they start to see some results in, or sometimes it's instant, honestly. But I mean, a
Mhm.
couple questions around modalities and letting it sink in.
Sure. So the sort of in terms of the amount of time you need for this to or begin to pay off, it's measured in weeks, not months, I think. Certainly
Wow.
in
Yeah.
my own case, I started a habit of walking every day after writing for a couple hours in the super early morning. So I get up when I'm working on a book, I get up around 5, I write for a couple hours, then I feed the dogs, take them out. Dogs are not great conversationalists, and I've got a bunch of things that I've been thinking about anyway. So that is a period in which I can let my mind just do its thing, and carry a notebook with me, and I have an idea, I write it down because it turns out I am not going to remember it. My mind
Mhm.
is a lot better at coming up with ideas than remembering ideas. And then we come back and I spend the next couple hours working through the implications of this insight that I've had. So I think that for that and it took me 3 or 4 weeks before doing this regularly before it really started to pay off,
Hmm.
and kind of my subconscious really started to expect it. I think that so as a matter of solving kind of everyday problems, how do you handle the transition from this paragraph to that paragraph or
Hmm.
deal with this piece of evidence? That kind of daily practice is really useful.
Mhm.
What we see with things like, the payoff for things like or of sabbaticals or deep play tend to
Right.
be, you might think of as solutions to bigger problems. So, I
Mm.
think, for example, of Lin Manuel Miranda coming up with the idea for Hamilton, right? He tells the story, he'd been working on In the Heights, he'd been performing it for 7 years, and his wife finally convinces him to take a vacation. And they go to a resort. Before he leaves, he throws a copy of Ron Cherno's biography, which he hadn't started reading yet, in his suitcase. He's sitting by the pool. He starts reading it, and he says, "As soon as I gave my mind a break from In the Heights, Hamilton jumped into it." Now, it took him several years, of course, after that, sort of, Hamilton didn't just appear all at once. It was the idea of, a play, a musical about this marginal figure who, who has this incredible story in early America. So there's still a lot of stuff you got to work through. But the big idea of sort of the story of Hamilton being worth telling in this interesting way, that's the thing that comes to him on vacation. Likewise, things like the idea for the design of the tokamak or the fusion reactor, the kind of circular donut reactor with sort of big magnets around it, came to sort of its originator on a ski trip in Colorado. And again, it's a sort of big idea that requires a lot of fleshing out. But, you know, also you will but there were a surprising number of those kinds of ideas that come on vacation or during periods when you're engaged in some sort of really serious hobby. Something like there was a study that indicated that something like 20% of ideas for new companies come to founders when they are on break,
Right,
when
you
they're
talk
on
about Instagram, you talk about tons of,
exactly.
really relevant case studies in the book. Yeah, that was
Right.
pretty impressive.
So, I think that for, that things like walks, other sorts of short breaks during the day are good for solving those kinds of low level sorts of tactical things.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
if you're the sort of person who also needs kind of strategic ideas,
of course.
where the market's going next, the idea for
Mhm,
not just sort of the daily walk is good for thinking about like the color of the button on,
right.
or an icon, but you're not going to get the idea for a new company or of
Mm.
necessarily on that or of on a walk like that. You need something bigger, and
And that's
that's
the
where
default network,
vacations come.
just getting sorry, that's the default
Mhm.
network, default mode network on that walk. It is being
Yep.
exercised at a surface level, but enough to help you break through problems, and then on the vacation, it's the same default mode network, it just has a bit more time to get rolling, or is that the same muscle we're talking about
Yeah.
there? Yeah.
So far as we know, and this is
Mhm.
limited by not being able to, like put. We don't have portable fMRI machines that allow us to
Right.
follow, or to
Soon,
follow
soon.
people around out in the real world. But it does seem like the mechanisms for like small c creativity, um,
Mm.
and big C creativity are that seems to involve the same parts of the brain, just kind of sort of, and the difference has to do with what it's working on and how long it has sort of to operate. So, however, no matter what we call it, I think it is, the important takeaway is we have some knowledge about sort of how to create the conditions for both
Mhm.
solving those smaller tactical problems and the big strategic ones, and they revolve around of uh, kind of taking rest more seriously rather than spending every moment of the day grinding away at problems.
Mhm. Alex, let's try to have a very specific use case. Let's call it a rest audit on not just my flow and how I work on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, but probably a
Hmm.
lot of entrepreneurs. I'm going to try to like summarize some of the things that we've talked about here and put into
Hmm.
a real life story. Let's say I'm planning out my month, my weekly schedule, my daily schedule next month. This month I'm busy with things. I'm going to let it percolate, go on some walks, but I'm going to actually like design my schedule and set up those boundaries you talked about. So, number one, I am going to do my deep work in the morning on whatever it is. I'm going to go on a walk. And before the walk, I'm going to think actively of a problem. And it's going to be at least a 20-minute walk. Could be longer. I'm not sure. But I'm going to work on that problem. And then I'm going to come back and spend some more time solving out that problem, have lunch, maybe repeat it again. We'll see where that flows. But I feel like the morning routine is going to be like that. And then
Hmm.
I'm going to plan out a sabbatical. And let's be specific about this too, or rather a retreat. every month, maybe for 2 days, I'll go camping. Or maybe every quarter I'll go for a 4-day retreat. Or maybe do a, a 2-week vacation. If I'm allowed to do that as an entrepreneur, I think I am, but I've got to build systems around that. And that's gonna be a bit of my flow. I've got my like my daily sort of my rest routine. I've got my, my quarterly retreats. I have my maybe monthly 2-day getaway. Is something like that a good cadence? And have I kind of encapsulated maybe a good rhythm to think about? Not to mention
Mhm.
perhaps 4-day work week. Like, let's talk about like how a founder can design their next 90 days with a
Right.
lot of these principles.
Yeah, so I think that the kind of sort of morning routine that you described is great. I think that one of the things, if you get up super early, a lot of us tend to need a nap sometime after lunch, which is
Right. Mhm.
perfectly fine. That is sort of, it turns out to be, a 20-minute nap is sort of more restorative for you than sort of another cup of coffee in the afternoon. It
Right.
can, for some people, sometimes also be a time when, or if they might do a little bit of sort of creative thinking in that state between being awake and being asleep.
Which I do,
However,
by the way. I
right,
usually do.
brilliant. I mean, there's
Mhm.
it works, sort of it's, I think, a bonus if that happens, but rest is good on its own. I think another important thing is the more you're able to have strong boundaries between work time and non-work time, the better, right? We assume that living in an always on world where we can carry our phones around, our offices around in our pockets, that we therefore have to be always on. But if you look at like studies of sort of fighter pilots or ER doctors or nurses, the ones who don't burn out on the job very tend to have tend to have really clear boundaries in their personal time, and so doing a little work to make yourself unreachable at least for part of the evening will, in the long run, I think, pay great dividends. In terms of during the week, if you can set aside a couple, let's say a couple hours or 4 hours a week for sort of deeper, more strategic thinking time, sort of. I guess that there's a distinction between sort of working at your business and working on it.
Of
This would
course,
be
yeah,
more
very
like
important.
this would be more like the working on your business
Mhm.
kind of time. Then that's really important because as a founder, that's the sort of stuff you're supposed to be doing.
Do you recommend
Then
that on, like, a Friday or a Saturday when you're not as reactive? Like, when's your
you
brain
know
best poised for that work? Is there any work research on it?
No, but I think that sort of what I would recommend is set up a regular time for it, which, I mean,
Mm,
it'll make it more likely that you actually do it,
of
and you
course.
can design workflows or systems to help preserve it. And then I think that another thing is the research on vacations tells us that vacations are really good, that the benefits of vacations peak around like day 7 in the
Hmm,
vacation itself, and
okay.
then the benefits are good for about 2 months or so. So in an ideal world, you should take like a week off every 3 months.
Oh, wow.
And that's rather than taking like 4 weeks during the summer. Um
Oh, okay, spread it out a bit more.
Exactly. And
Mm,
indeed, like if you look at like the vacation schedules of very wealthy people, they tend to take shorter, more frequent vacations than
mm.
taking 2 months off and, going and sort of wherever it is that super rich people go.
Are these full
Um,
are these full disconnects, by the way? Like, if I'm next quarter gonna take a week off, which I'm getting uncomfortable
yeah.
thinking about, which is, I think, the problem with a lot of our culture,
Mhm.
is this like a straight vacation, phone off, no internet, out of office, or can I, like, work an hour a day just for the stuff I like? Or am I thinking about problems to solve, or am I just straight up free flowing and then having a notepad when ideas come to me like, "W let's put some boundaries on this vacation because I feel
Yeah.
like people may violate some."
Keep it to a minimum, I can certainly understand that, or if the anxiety around coming back from vacation and then having so much work that you need another vacation to recover from, sort of all the stuff you got to catch up with. The that, however, or of the more you are able to sort of structure and delegate tasks to other people, the more you know, the more you can disconnect with confidence. I think that, we have, you know, all too often we fall prey to this kind of heroic ideal of the entrepreneur, which is that I am the only person who can solve it.
Yes.
Um, you know, and that makes us feel important. But if we want to build something enduring, then
Mhm.
you need from day one to start thinking about how you can automate certain things, how you can share responsibility, how
Mhm.
you can construct a system that is going to survive your being out of the office for, order for a week.
Definitely.
Because
Definitely.
if you do that, the odds are you're going to build a more enduring company that is going to be, number one, is going to be around longer, and number two, is going to have you around longer, because you will not have destroyed yourself in 2 years in a kind of arms race against sort of technical obsolescence, and sort of an effort to build something that you can then like sell after 2 years, rather than
Mhm.
something that's going to stick around. I think that
Mhm.
one other thing I would point out is that an awful lot of our assumptions about hustle culture and being always on, et cetera, came about in a period in the last decade where money was really cheap. There was a sort
Mm.
of set of economic conditions that created incentives for assuming that working titanically long hours for a quick exit was what success was going to look like. And it's not clear that those conditions are going to be or of it feels like those conditions are changing, right? Andreessen Horowitz is talking about going back into hardware and building things, and it in Silicon Valley, at least, it feels like a lot of the dumb money has evaporated,
Mhm.
and people are more thoughtful about wanting to build things for or invest in things for the long run, rather than shiny blinky things around which you can get a quick exit. What
Mhm.
that suggests is that maybe you need also to rethink how you work as a leader, so
Mhm.
that sort of you don't build yourself a quick exit in the form of 90-hour weeks that are going to sort of force an exit upon you, but
Mhm.
rather working in a way that will let you build something more sustainable and be more sustainable yourself.
And I think it's the example you set for your culture as well, right? I mean, yeah, I
Oh
think it's a
yeah.
definite mindset thing. And again, I really want to dig into the 4 hour or
Hmm,
that's the Freudian slip from Tim Ferriss, but the 4 day work week, maybe 4 hours a day, depends on how you look at it. But
yeah.
before we get into that, I like to ask a lot of our guests this, and you're starting to get into this definition. What do you define as the work grind?
So I don't beats me. I mean, I think that I suppose sort of I think of grind as um time of diminishing productivity, where you are in a sense kind of working against your own fatigue in an increasingly fruitless attempt to solve problems that you could solve immediately the next day with a good night's rest.
Love it.
That's what
Great
I think
definition.
grind is. Yeah. I think
Totally.
grind is
Totally.
stupid. So,
Yeah. I mean, definitely, but you're so sucked into the task. I just wanna solve it now, but I think patience and zooming out is something that is very hard to do, but, obviously,
absolutely.
that's been the theme of our conversation, so thanks for
Right.
that.
No, and I think that, it takes time to to disaggregate, the kind of excitement of working on problems, or,
Mm.
the sense of absorption that you
Mhm.
can get from, to recognize that we can feel these even when we actually aren't making progress. And I think an important thing that separates someone who's a seasoned professional from someone who's new is being able to see that those are not exactly the same things. That feeling like you're in flow and actually getting work done, that's not a one to one match.
Hmm.
and being able to see that, okay, at the point where, or of I'm no longer really able to work as effectively on this problem by attacking it directly, I still may have enough, my brain may still have enough energy to work on it if I
Right.
go for that walk now. So
Mhm.
you've got a little of that kind of shadow of flow, that shadow of absorption, but you can still, you can attack the problem, but in this different kind of sort of modality.
Yeah, love that, and, I think it's just about building, discernment, understanding your body, and, like, that's, like it's like people who try to do meditation and they do a minute and like, I can't do this well. It's like what the monks built up to do. It's this discernment of flow and it can take your whole life, but I think you got to start somewhere. Alex,
Correct.
4-day work weeks. I know that's a huge thing of something that you're advocating. You've got more data on that. Obviously, if you think of Basecamp, and that's a famous Silicon Valley company that number one has. I don't think they've raised any money, and they've been remote first, and they've done 4 hour or 4-day work weeks. And Jason Fried's pretty adamant about that.
Mhm.
Talk about, yeah, where do you see that going? And especially post pandemic, we're in February of 2023. How should leaders and entrepreneurs that are going to have teams, that are going to scale, they're going to be building these sustainable cultures? How do we think about that? Where's it all going?
So, the 4-day work week is something that I got interested in, as a solution to the as an answer to the question. All right, it's cool if you're a Nobel Prize winner and you can organize your schedule to get as much rest as you want, but what about everybody else? And what I realized was that this is, for almost all of us, first of all, a collective action problem, in the sense that we all, we all have challenges with overwork and work life balance and finding time for or to deep work, and that we can best solve those problems collectively, that will yield more enduring, more sustainable solutions than the ones we can just try and come up with through our own private life hacks. It also turns out to be, the evidence tells us, really good for organizations. That they can become more productive, more profitable, and sort of be, sort of better, more attractive places to work. And it's the key is that technology has actually made us a lot more productive, but those gains have been buried underneath overly long meetings and tech-driven distractions and poorly designed workdays. And so in a sense, the 4-day week is already here. It's just buried underneath these outmoded ways of working. And so if you can do a few simple things, redesign meetings, redesign the workday, use technologies in ways that help you get into flow, or to focus on your most important value added work, then it turns out sort of the 4-day week is a lot more sort of accessible than you might imagine. The other important thing is that is that it brings benefits to everybody, right? It's not just something that your top performers negotiate sort of for themselves. That and it's also not the thing that, let's say, a working mom sort of negotiates so that they can have more time with the kids, but which in the course of this might slow down the careers because they're no longer seen as, as hardcore and dedicated as they had been previously. Because it's something that everybody builds and achieves together, it is sort of it's a it takes the search for better balance and more time from being a zero sum game to being a win-win. um I think all However, it is something that requires or of be, being embraced from the top. Every company every company that does it because they have a founder who believes in it and who also practices it themselves. I think for some founders, the 4-day week is a way of kind of enforcing better boundaries and giving themselves more time by by institutionalizing it and giving it to everybody. But no matter whether you start off wanting it for yourself, or you do it because you want to boost recruitment and retention, you want to compete with sort of bigger companies for sort of outstanding talent, or you want to solve other enduring problems that individual, sort of individual efforts or mindfulness classes or sort of flexible work programs have not solved. It is important for leadership to practice this and to do it sort of themselves, because if they don't, nobody else is going to take it seriously. So, but the good news is founders benefit from it as much as anybody, and it's something that everyone can. And it turns out to be a great way of of incentivizing everybody to build something that is that is great for them both immediately and good for the company in the long run.
Yeah, sustainability in every sense of the word. One part of sustainability, I guess, for people's joy and happiness, what really caught my attention in the book that you wrote, specifically Rest, and you've got a few fantastic books, was deep play.
Hmm.
It's like adult coloring books started to make a comeback not too long ago, and I don't know if that qualifies as deep play, but talk about deep play and again, like how does that tie to creativity? And there's some pretty cool examples you had around deep play and innovation. Yeah, I'd love to end
Hmm.
off with that.
Sure. So, we often think of hobbies or, or to sports or things as competitors with our working lives, right? But it turns out like there were lots of famous entrepreneurs or famous scientists turn out to be like world class mountain climbers or sailors or chess players. And and I wanted to understand why this was, right? Why invest this kind of time and energy in things that are, potentially like literally physically dangerous as well as being very time consuming. And it turns out that that people who have these kinds of hobbies talk about them as offering the same kinds of rewards as their work at its best, but at a very different time scale, as offering rewards with a real kind of clarity, and while also giving them a break from the parts of like their everyday jobs that are least fulfilling. So scientists, for example, who are mountain climbers, talk about mountain climbing being like science, right? It's a deep engagement in nature. It requires intense concentration. You take a problem and you break it down in a lot of little pieces, and then you got to solve it. The good part is at the end of the day, you have the reward of being at the top of the mountain, and it's also very physical in a way that, let's say, laboratory work is not. Likewise, executives who are climbers talk about it as offering the same sorts of rewards as their work. Because it's about teamwork, it's about inspiring people, about discovering, sort of the outer edge of your own boundaries, and maybe and sort of pushing past them. So but I think that what's important about this is, number one, it serves as a kind of regulator to get you out of the office, or and to sort of to get you to take a break. But it also reminds you, it's a place that reminds you of the things that you love best about your work when it goes really well. And I think that that can serve as a sort of, it can kind of, rediscovering that kind of passion is important for allowing you to keep going through those periods where this, sort of that are sort of the long march rather than, rather than, the inspired sprint. And so that's why deep play turns out not to be just a waste of time, or or of a diversion from our work, but like reconnects us with what we love best about our work, and gives us both the physical and the mental energy or to keep doing it.
Wonderfully put. Thank you, Alex. As I look at my notepad, which I like to keep throughout interviews, to summarize, I think the themes and insights of our talk, and by all means, this might spark new ideas, so jump in if you like. This all started when you were in Cambridge and you had just come off being burnt out. And you were sort of like on a mini sabbatical. And I think, something you mentioned a lot throughout the interview was having this creative subconscious, right, and having it bubble to the surface. And I think that happened right off the bat when you were in Cambridge, and all the stories you gave, whether it's Eisenhower, Darwin, and you gave a lot of the micro of walking, daily planning, napping, deep play, and you also zoomed out to the macro, right? Which was the sabbatical, the 7-day vacations. It was very cool to see the science and the structure and the case studies of how resting so that your creative subconscious can give you breakthrough ideas and joy. I thought was like really well put. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs overlook that. And it's so
Mhm.
easy to, because you're not sold on it. It's not designed in hustle culture. But as you said, hustle culture is actually a new phenomenon because of, I mean, you think about why education's broken. Oh, it was the industrial age, there was a different world, and there was a certain reason for that. It just hasn't modernized. This, as you said, from the last 10, 20 years, mainly Silicon Valley, because people wanted to exit within 2 years in unsustainable ways. And some
Mhm.
did. Fine. Many did not. That is why there's a hustle culture. But now people are, now that we're in, perhaps let's call it a mini recession, people are stepping back, not just with what makes a great company, but what's sustainable for my health. Like, what's the
Right.
long term game? And I think it was very nice to see you put that all together. And I know I want to take more vacations. And if I feel like that's productive and it's setting a good example for my staff and for our stakeholders, I mean, that's pretty amazing. So I love that you're at the forefront of this. And I think our entrepreneurs can definitely take many things from our conversation and also do a deeper dive into your books.
Brilliant. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Alex, thanks so much and flow well. Really appreciate you and keep doing the great things you're doing.
Thanks for having me on, Paul. It's a real pleasure.
Likewise.